Let me do the useful version of this story, because the useless version is easy. The useless version talks like the servers were unplugged by a vengeful god, and spends 10 minutes pretending a sad mood is the same thing as a news report. The useful version gets to the point. Blizzard released patch 12.0.5 for World of Warcraft. The patch landed badly enough that Blizzard posted a public apology, saying it was not up to our standards and had caused justified frustration. Then Mike Ybarra, a former Blizzard president, looked at that mess and said World of Warcraft needs a reset or the decline continues. A rough patch, a public apology, angry players, and a former executive saying this is not just one bad week anymore. Start with Blizzard's own words, because that is where the case begins. Blizzard admitted the patch was not up to standard. Blizzard admitted players were justified in being frustrated. Blizzard also said the team was working around the clock to stabilize the game and address the biggest issues. So the first useful point is simple. This was not a tiny issue inflated by bored people online. This was bad enough that Blizzard decided it needed a formal statement instead of quiet fixes and polite silence. When a company does that, it is reacting to visible failure, not minor turbulence. Then comes the player response, and this is where the story gets sharper. Players did not just read the apology, nod and move on. In the official discussion, many of them pushed back on Blizzard's wording. If you want more breakdowns that actually pin the facts, instead of drowning them in drama, subscribe and stick around. Some questioned what Blizzard's standards even are if patches keep arriving in this state. Others argued the problem was not just this patch, but the pattern around it. That matters because the apology did not restore trust. It exposed the trust problem. Blizzard called the launch below standard, and the audience treated that line like evidence that the standard itself has been slipping for a while. The issue stopped being just the bugs and became the company's credibility. That takes you to the next point. The reaction was not only about one feature, one broken event, or one annoying bug. A lot of players treated this as part of a pattern. One bad patch can happen to any live game. Repeated rough patches, followed by repeated apologies, suggest a process problem. The community is not only reacting to this patch, it is reacting to accumulated memory. People feel like they know the sequence already. The patch lands badly. Problems spread, Blizzard apologizes, fixes arrive later. Then the next launch shows up, and the same questions start all over again. At some point, that stops feeling like bad luck, and starts feeling like routine. How fast these patches come out is making things worse, and that is one of the most useful details in the whole story. Some players in the official thread said Blizzard should slow down the patch cadence, if slower releases mean better quality. That cuts directly against the live service sales pitch. Companies love to sell speed as proof of support. More updates are supposed to mean the game is healthy and well managed. Here, some players were saying the opposite. They were saying faster updates are not helping, if the result is lower quality, more disruption, and another apology post. Blizzard itself gave you the grounding for that argument, when it admitted players had justified frustration, and said the team was working around the clock to stabilize the game. That is not healthy momentum. That is digital cleanup. Faster delivery is not impressive if the company has to spend the next stretch publicly explaining why the thing it just released needed urgent stabilization. Speed is not competence when the output keeps forcing the same repair cycle. Now bring in Mike Ybarra, because his quote matters for a specific reason. He did not drop the reset line during some calm week, when everybody was bored and looking for a dramatic headline. He stepped in after Blizzard had admitted the patch caused justified frustration, and after players had already started questioning the process around it. That timing changes the quote from random commentary into a verdict on the moment. The company had already stumbled in public. The audience was already saying this felt familiar. Ybarra then pushed the argument one step further and said the game needs something larger than another repair cycle. That is why the quote traveled. It did not feel detached from reality. It felt like the blunt conclusion people were already moving toward. But it is not just the code that is under pressure. Confidence in the creative direction is taking hits too. That is where Eric Covington comes in. He is a former Blizzard Quest designer, and he publicly criticized the current story tone by comparing it to a Saturday morning cartoon. You do not need to agree with every word of that criticism to understand why it sticks. Technical problems are easier to forgive when players still believe the larger direction is strong. Technical problems feel heavier when people already suspect the game is creatively softer, flatter, or less focused than it used to be. So the patch problem does not exist in isolation. It lands inside a wider climate of weaker confidence. That combination is why the reset angle works so well. If this were only about bugs, the story would stay smaller. If this were only about story criticism, the story would stay subjective. Put them together, and the picture gets worse. Blizzard shipped a rough patch. Blizzard apologized. Players challenged the apology and questioned the standard. Some players said the pace should slow down. Ybarra said the game needs a reset. Eric Covington criticized the narrative tone. That is not one isolated complaint. That is a stack of related signals pointing in the same direction. The issue is no longer only whether patch 12.0.5 was messy. The issue is whether Blizzard is managing World of Warcraft in a way that keeps draining trust. This also fits the broader Blizzard pattern. Your audience already knows. This is the same company that was happy to flirt with early access VIP language around midnight and test how much extra packaging players would tolerate around access and hype. This patch mess is not some isolated stumble dropped from the sky. It lands inside a longer chain of Blizzard decisions that keep asking the audience for confidence, while giving them fresh reasons to be skeptical. That is why loyal viewers are not hearing one bad patch in a vacuum. They are hearing another entry in the Blizzard saga, where the company keeps reaching for trust, after it has already spent some of it. That is also why this story reaches beyond massive multiplayer online players. It fits a wider live service pattern. Ship fast, fix later, apologize after impact, ask players to stay patient, then do it again. Blizzard is not unique here, but Blizzard is a visible example. The company has the size, the history, and the audience to make every stumble feel like a case study. When a smaller game stumbles, people might shrug. When World of Warcraft stumbles badly enough for Blizzard to apologize in public, it becomes a bigger symbol of the same industry habit. Companies keep asking players to treat the latest failure as a separate event, even when the structure keeps looking familiar. People are not only reacting to one patch. They are reacting to a model that keeps asking for patience after the damage is already done. This is where bad commentary usually ruins the story, by reaching for the lazy line. World of Warcraft is dead. No, that is weak, and it is less accurate than the harder point. The evidence does not prove the game is finished. The evidence shows something more useful. Blizzard keeps damaging confidence, and then asking players to treat each new patch problem like it should be judged in isolation. That is a much stronger argument, because it matches what is actually on the table. Blizzard admitted the patch went badly. Players questioned the wording, the standards, the pace, and the communication. Ybarra treated the moment as evidence that a reset is needed. Eric Covington's criticism added to the sense that the problem is not only technical, so the closing thesis should stay blunt. World of Warcraft is not in trouble just because it is old. It is in trouble when Blizzard keeps making old problems feel current again. Age alone does not destroy trust. Repeated disappointment does. Players can forgive one bad patch. They can forgive one apology. They do not keep forgiving the same pattern forever. That is what makes this story worth covering. Blizzard admitted failure, players pushed back on the explanation, and the broader process. Mike Ybarra argued the game needs a reset. Eric Covington's criticism reinforced the confidence problem. That is a real breakdown, with a clear chain of facts, reactions, and implications. One last point should be said plainly, because this is where the angry part belongs. Players are not asking for magic. They are asking for a release process that does not keep producing the same public embarrassment. That is a reasonable demand. They are not wrong to ask why large issues keep reaching live release. They are not wrong to question whether faster cadence is hurting quality. They are not wrong to hear the same corporate language and stop believing it means anything. Blizzard created that reaction by repeating the same public pattern too many times. The company does not just have patch trouble. It has a credibility problem, and every messy launch makes the next promise worth less. Damage keeps repeating until people stop treating it as an exception and start treating it as normal. That is worse, because normal disappointment is how trust actually dies. And that is why the erosion angle matters more than fake death talk. Death talk is lazy clickbait. Erosion is the real warning label. Death lets people pretend there was one dramatic ending. Erosion tells the uglier truth, which is that Blizzard keeps shaving confidence off the game a little at a time, then acting surprised that players are less willing to clap for the next promise. That is why this story lands. Not because one patch broke World of Warcraft forever, but because one more bad patch made the broader pattern impossible to ignore again. The company keeps asking for faith after public mistakes, and players keep getting reminded why faith is getting more expensive. That is not a server funeral. That is a trust invoice. And Blizzard keeps sending it to the same audience.